when the CIA and MI6 toppled President Yanukovych in 2014, why did the new government begin killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country?
Well, because the people that propelled the coup that overthrew Yanukovych were ultranationalists. Recall that the Maidan, when it began in November 2013, this was the protest against Yanukovych because he delayed signing a trade deal with the EU. There wasn't a clear goal of regime change. It was mostly people upset that Yanukovych was, in their eyes, turning away from the West and aligning closer with Russia, when in reality it was actually more complex. Yanukovych had read the fine print of the deal that the European Union was putting before him, and the European Union was asking him to basically cut off people's pensions, cut off subsidies for energy, and basically make the cost of living higher for Yanukovych's constituency, especially in the east of the country, where it also was saying that you have to cut off ties to Russia. And Yanukovych recognized that for him this would be a political disaster. So he delayed signing that deal, which led to protests, which the U.S. and their allies then exploited by trying to push for regime change, and in the process siding with a small faction of hardline Maidan elements, people like the Svoboda Party, which were founded with neo-Nazi inspirations. And so after the coup, which was pushed by elements like Svoboda, the ultranationalists got a lot of senior cabinet posts in the new government, and they took up their movement's top priorities, which included essentially wiping out Russian culture in the country. The first parliamentary act that was seriously taken up was to essentially ban Russia as an official state language. And in response to this, you had people in the East rising up in protest. And the ultranationalists, rather than trying to, broker a compromise, took this as an opportunity to escalate their attacks. And you had things happen like the Odessa massacre, which was in early May 2014, where dozens of people who were protesting the Maidan and calling for their rights as ethnic Russians, they were burned alive in a trade union building by a fascist mob. So events like that helped galvanize this protest. And then you also had the CIA coming over. John Brennan slipped into Kyiv in mid-April. And according to a source that I spoke to who was there at the meeting, told his counterparts, who he had helped put in office, that you should launch an attack on the Donbass. You should forget about negotiation. You should, and we'll help you out. And lo and behold, 2 days later, that's exactly what the Ukrainian government did.
Is there a meaning to the word, a meaning with significance to the word Maidan?
Well, Maidan is simply the square where the protest began.
Okay. And this is the event orchestrated in part, or at least promoted, by Victoria Nuland and her colleagues.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back to that period, you look at the media outlets that were promoting the Maidan protest, promoting the coup. So many of them have ties to U.S. funding. In fact, there was one Ukrainian outlet that just spontaneously emerged right as the Maidan began, like out of nowhere. All of a sudden, there was a brand new Ukrainian outlet, and it was funded by the U.S. government. And Nuland bragged about this, that the U.S. had invested billions of dollars in promoting what she called Ukrainian civil society, which in real life means fronts for U.S. interests, fronts that the U.S. can use to promote its regime change agenda. To the point where, after Zelensky got elected, he was elected on a mandate of peace. And in the first stages of his term, he did take some genuine steps towards trying to make peace and towards implementing the Minsk Accords, which was the European brokered pact endorsed by the UN Security Council to end the war that began with the Maidan coup. And as Zelensky took steps, there was a really famous document put out by a group of so-called Ukrainian civil society members. It's a bunch of groups. And Ivan Kachinovsky, who was a Ukrainian-Canadian professor at University of Ottawa, he pointed out that if you look at the list of signatories, the vast majority are all funded by the U.S. and their allies. And what did this letter say? The statement said to Zelensky, do not implement the Minsk Accords. That, recognizing that ethnic Russians in the East have legitimate grievances, that would be a red line for us. And allowing the Russian Orthodox Church to operate in Ukraine, that's a red line. So at every turn, the U.S., through its funded organizations in Ukraine, its proxies, promoted confrontation.
All right. So President Obama leaves office and President Trump comes in, and Trump begins arming Zelensky's government to the teeth. Is there any articulable reason for that?
Well, the reason why Trump armed Ukraine was because of Russiagate. This was at the time when there was this all-consuming frenzy of allegations that Russia had waged a massive interference campaign to install Trump in office, and that Trump's campaign was possibly complicit. And it seems so funny to look back on now, but this was the dominant story of the first Trump years, and nobody challenged it in establishment media. Unfortunately, a lot of progressive media too. And so with that consensus solidified that Trump was the product of Russia and that he might even be a Russian conspirator, the hawks in Trump's White House took advantage of this, and to dispel the notion he was a Russian agent, encouraged him to authorize hawkish steps that Obama hadn't even taken, including arming Ukraine. And so many accounts have come out since. The New York Times recently reported that all while Trump's opponents were, just hyperventilating about him possibly being a Russian asset, U.S. intelligence officials thought this was great because it meant that this whole thing about Trump being a Russian asset was a good cover for Trump's administration to undertake hawkish policies against Russia and Ukraine, including building up, we learned from the New York Times, a number of secret bases and expanding their training and intelligence operations with Ukraine, basically turning Ukraine into even more of a CIA proxy. So Russiagate was the perfect storm because it encouraged Trump to escalate tensions with Russia, all while incentivizing the media and the political establishment to ignore what Trump was doing because they were so beholden to the conspiracy theory that he was actually doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin.
I mean, you can't make this up. The same deep state that was trying to ruin his presidency was encouraging him to arm the Ukrainians to wage the eventual proxy war against Putin.
That's right, and this is what so much of my forthcoming book is all about. It's about how, contrary to the view that we're ruled by elected leaders, when it comes to matters of war and peace, it's the entrenched foreign policy bureaucracy that gets its way, and that's true as much about Trump as it is under Obama. Obama, if you read all the accounts, he didn't want to arm Ukraine. He was very worried about weapons, U.S. weapons going to neo-Nazis, and he was very worried that this would provoke Russia. And he also was worried that if we keep arming Ukraine, it's going to give Ukraine the false impression that they can win if we ultimately provoke Russia into invading. So Barack Obama foresaw all of this. But ultimately, if you look at the record of his administration, it didn't matter what he really thought because Victoria Nuland, as a senior State Department official, took it upon herself, along with others like Daniel Freed, who was serving in the State Department, to basically undermine Obama's own professed policy of giving the Minsk Accords a chance. And so Nuland encouraged an escalation. And finally, when Obama left office, the same foreign policy bureaucracy that Nuland was a part of took advantage of Russiagate to push Trump even more than Obama had been pushed. And that's why they got the weapons sent. That's why in Trump's first year, Congress also passed a measure solidifying Nuland's sanctions that she had designed and making it impossible for Trump to undo them. And Trump signed that bill. He signed it. He didn't want to, but he signed it because, under the storm of Trump-Russia allegations, he had no choice. So there's a recurring theme here that no matter what the elected president wants, it's the hawkish, entrenched voices that have their say. And by the way, that's also true in Ukraine, because what happened in Ukraine after Zelensky was elected, the ultranationalist far right, which was very small numerically, but very large in power in the soil of the government, which had been empowered by the Maidan coup with the help of the U.S., they told Zelensky, forget it. Like, no matter what you want, it doesn't matter. And if you make peace with Russia, we'll kill you. Multiple people in Ukraine's far right threatened Zelensky's life. We've talked about a few of them before. And in fact, one more just came this week. The Times of London interviewed a guy named Sergei Sterneko of Right Sector. Okay, and this is what he said just recently. If Zelensky were to give any unconquered land away, he would be a corpse politically and then for real. It would be a bomb under our sovereignty. People would never accept it. And you can go back and see similar statements made to Zelensky right after he took office. Another member of Right Sector said that Zelensky will hang from a tree if he betrays the Maidan Revolution. So this is a recurring theme in both the U.S. and Ukraine. Whatever the elected president wants, it's always undermined by the entrenched hawks in both countries.
So when Trump complains that Zelensky is being unrealistic, by not ceding the territories that Russia occupies, is it fair to say Zelensky has no choice?
Well, Zelensky, look, if Zelensky, I think, had more integrity and more courage, he could resign and say, "Look, I'm in an impossible situation where the far right won't let me make peace, and the U.S. up to this point hasn't given me any help." But he doesn't have that integrity. He's chosen to be a tool of the far right. I just wonder, and it's a counterfactual now, had there not been this convergent pressure from the ultranationalists in Ukraine, coupled with hawks in Washington, who encouraged Zelensky at every single turn to ignore Minsk. William Taylor, who was a top U.S. diplomat under Trump in Ukraine in Trump's first term, William Taylor went to Zelensky personally and told him to ignore German efforts to save the Minsk Accords, told him it was a terrible idea. So in a different world, had there not been this converging pressure on Zelensky, I don't know what Zelensky would have done. I don't know who he really is. But all I know is since then, he's turned into a complete tool of both ultranationalists and the U.S.
Who is the international monitor about which you have spoken recently, now blaming the war on both NATO and these nationalist fanatics?
His name is Benoit Paré. He's a French national, and he spent 7 years deployed in Ukraine with the OSCE, which is a European-dominated monitoring group that was trying to impose a ceasefire in Ukraine and see about the implementation of the Minsk Accords, which was the aforementioned pact to end the Donbass war that began with the 2014 Maidan Coup. And speaking to Paré, what he told me was that basically, in his view, Russia was provoked in Ukraine, that the majority of atrocities in the Donbass war were committed by the Ukrainian government. Not that the Russian-backed rebels were scot-free. I mean, they committed atrocities of their own. But that he says he sees there's so many junctures at which there were provocations of the rebels, that Ukraine was the main obstacle to implementing the Minsk Accords because Ukraine's parliament refused to pass a law that would have allowed for greater autonomy for the Donbass, which was the key requirement of Minsk. And the reason why Ukrainian parliament didn't pass that law is because in August 2015, when they tried, again, the ultranationalists, extremists held a deadly protest outside parliament at which security forces were killed and many were injured. So this was a policy of what the Ukrainian-American journalist Lev Golinkin calls veto through violence, that whenever there were steps towards peace, Ukraine's ultranationalists, with the tacit or direct backing of the U.S., imposed a policy of veto through violence. And Paré, being on the ground with the OSCE, he saw this up close. And he reports and confirms, what was previously known, that in the days leading up to Russia's invasion in February 2022, there was a massive escalation of shelling coming from the Ukrainian government side onto the rebel-controlled side. And that was taken by Russia and its allies, that Ukraine was preparing for a major assault on the Donbass. So, it speaks to Russian claims that that essentially the people of the Donbass were at risk unless Russia took action.